Welcome to the final installment of our webinar series integrating with the STK. So before we showed you how to connect to STK from MATLAB, Python, and Excel, as well how to build the UI plugins in C# and deploy them to the STK application and how to use them. So today I will talk about the final kind of way you can interact with the STK, so which is as a standalone applications. So kind of just to summarize, there are basically three ways you can customize STK using our API, or what we call our object model. And the way we distinguish them is based on what's the relationship between your code and STK itself. So you can build either web pages or UI plugins to live directly inside of STK, so it will share the screen and it will have a very close interaction between two applications. The second way, which is the first three webinars that we had, was about controlling STK from another application. And the third way that I'm going to talk about today is completely standalone. But what I really want to highlight is once you connect to STK application and once you get the root object, all the code that you're going to write subsequently is identical. So while connecting and getting hold of STK root might be a little differently between different application types, overall the code will be exactly the same. So the standalone applications can either exist as a console application, so without the user interface, or with the user interface. And we'll actually talk about the ones with the user interface today. Additionally, the application with the user interface or standalone applications were original way we had created our custom applications. We didn't have a way to connect to a STK or write UI plugins. So with STK 7, what we did was we knew our customers wanted our calculation, but not necessarily they wanted to run inside of our desktop application. So the idea was to take the UI portion of STK and present just calculation logic that we called STK Engine. And in that process, we also kind of had a grand vision of STK being built on top of the engine, STK desktop application, and making it open source so users can modify it as they will. But when we actually look at the scope application, probably would delay STK release by a couple of years, and we were not in position at the time to do that. But even though we didn't realize the original idea, the STK object model very closely follows the logic of the desktop application. And that's very, very important to understand when you write the code. So I use STK application as a guide when I write my code, as well as the programming guide to figure out the syntax. So if you remember one thing from the last 5 webinars, including this one, is use the STK and the programming help as the tools to write your code. So I'm going to now move to actual topic of discussion, and I will create a brand new project in Visual Studio. I'm using 13, but you can pretty much use any Visual Studio you want. And I will create a new user application that will include our 3D or a globe control and our 2D or a map controls. So I'm gonna, sorry about that. I will select new project and I will select Windows Forms application. And I'll just call it web test. So while this creates, it will create a form 1 for me. The one thing that I like to do is change the name of this. Because in many cases, I would create a sample application and end up sending it to customer, and then they'll look at it and go, oh, you have form 1 on it. You don't know what you're doing. So I just like to follow good practices. So, and I'm going to change my title just for fun. So, what I'm going to do next once Visual Studio decides to cooperate is I will add, like I said, globe and map controls. But before I really do that, another good practice that I like to point out is you want your application to grow and shrink correctly if you minimize or maximize windows. So instead of adding my globe and my 2D controls directly onto the form, I like to add the split containers. So kind of my form can remain in a well-organized shape while my application form, okay, finally, grows and shrinks. So, and because I tried this, oh, that's good. So first thing I have to do is go to my toolbox and click on Choose Items and go to COM Components. And this time, oh, okay, so pretty quickly I was able to get the list of all the COM components, and because I have STK 9, 10, 11 installed, I have all the controls available. Some of you might not see these controls. And the reason why you don't see them is if you look at my path, it says program files x86. So that means these controls were found in 32-bit version of STK. If you don't have 32-bit version of STK, only 64-bit version of STK, you have two solutions to that why you are missing controls. One solution is to install 32-bit STK. And reason why we recommend that is Visual Studio is 32-bit application, so fortunately it does not recognize 64-bit controls. Again, it's completely out of our control. The second way you can do that is if you go to our help, under develop, so this is programming help on our website, and under develop custom application there's using 64-bit engine for .NET applications, and we have instructions there how to get around the problem, and also link to explaining why this problem is happening. I'll come back to this a little bit later on. So I will add the controls, and then I'll do what I mentioned before, and I'll add my split containers. I'll add one, make it horizontal, and I'll add another one and kind of make it look same size, and I'll just drop globe control eventually. Ooh, beautiful. And tell me I have no license. That'll be interesting. So I'll drop the controls, and another thing I'm going to do, the whole point of using the containers is so the controls can size, so I'll choose fill as a dock. So I will pause at this point for you to catch up a little bit, and I will this webinar is also being recorded as well as our previous webinars. So if you missed the step, you can go back and look at the recording. So now we have, and then let me just see what happens if I run this. It tells me I have no license. Interesting. Another. Why? Oh God! I created a VB application. Interesting. So I'll actually go back and use the prepared ones I already had, because I wasn't planning on creating a VB application. So imagine I did mess up and actually did this right, and I came to this point. The one thing I wanted to point out, if you did do it correctly and use C#, you would see these two DLLs added automatically when you added your controls. So you see this name STKX. The reason for that name is when we originally built what we call now STK Engine, the internal name was STKX. So while we change all our marketing and public-facing materials to say STKX, the name of the DLL and the name of the license required to run this remain STKX. And also, if you build a standalone application, you would have to create, with just the console, you would have to create STK AG STKX application. So again, reason why you're seeing STKX is that was the original name for the engine. So I will comment this out. Oops. And another thing that if you are working with the STK object model, you can go to add references, and most of the time you're going to work with STK objects, STK util, and STK VGT libraries. So these are three primary namespaces that you're going to work with. So I always add those immediately. Sometimes I want to add graphics or some other library, and in order for you to see those, you can browse and go to STK install directory, bin primary assemblies, And here is the list of all the DLLs that you can use depending on your application type. But the ones that you really want to, that you're always going to use no matter what, are these three. So STK Objects, STK Util, which stands for Utilities, and STK VGT, that helps with Analysis Workbench. So another thing I like to do is, when I run the first time, I like to put my STK root here first and run this way. And I'll explain what I did in a minute. And of course, I'm going to get an error. So the reason why I did this is I added a using statement for STK objects, and I'm creating a root object. But if you followed any of the previous examples, you'll see that you usually have to get hold of application object first before you can create a root object. And usually root object is property called personality2 on the application object. In this case, by creating our controls, it automatically creates STKX application object for me, and then I can call this code to create a new root object. But my controls have to be initialized first. And if I go to the designer, which is the code that's automatically generated by Visual Studio when we add controls to the form, I can see my controls being created. And actually, this code here is identical to our recommended solution for getting around having a 32-bit STK installed. So we are basically asking you to manually, copy and paste the code that was automatically generated by Visual Studio. I find it easier just to install 32-bit STK, but I have access to software, so it's not a problem for me. But if it's an issue for you, unfortunately, this is the only way to get those controls on your form. So again, you'll have to modify the code that Visual Studio tells you not to modify it. So I'm going to go back. I'm going to move this line here. And again, the reason why I mentioned this is normally you would not put creation of the root above initialized components. You want that to happen first no matter what. But I saw people use onFormLoad method to add this code of creating a new root object. Unfortunately, onLoad happens before the class initialization code. So this code was running before initialized components. So you have to be very aware of where you're putting your code. So, and I'll comment this line here just to create my dummy scenario, and hopefully I have license. So because I'm doing everything in initialization, all the code to create scenario is being run, and eventually it's going to pop up. So here's my scenario, here's my globe control, and if I maximize my window, they kind of grow nicely with my form. So that's why, again, it's just good practice that I like to follow. It's not required necessary. So the the topic of this class is creating independent application using C# and Java. So far I used C#. So I'll go to Eclipse now and kind of show you again using Java how we did the same thing. So the way our code is generated, our object model is generated for C# is using Microsoft's tool that takes C and C++ interfaces that we have and then generates the libraries that can be used with the .NET applications like C# or VB.NET. For Java, we had to go another way, and we had to create what's called Java Native Interface, or JNI, bridge between our C, C++ code, and Java. So when creating Java applications, the first thing you have to do is somewhere. Sorry about that. Where's my main? Oh. So what I'm showing you now is the finished tutorial. So we don't have enough time to build a Java application from scratch. It will take sorry, it will take a long time. So I'm going to show you basically finished product that's available as a code sample, as a part of our code samples. We have a code samples how to use Swing and AVT libraries that come with build with Java. You can also use Window Builder or NetBeans or another tool to actually build UI, because working directly with Swing can be challenging, and I find it very challenging for myself. So AGI kind of provides some helper functions, and all our code samples are using those helper functions. So instead of building application completely from scratch, I kind of like to use those libraries as a starting point. And this application is also using that as a starting point. So if I run this application, and here it will create, I think there's only 3D. So we have the container application, and we have identical a globe control as we do it in Visual Studio. So just kind of, and if I were to create a scenario, you will see the same globe as you would in C#. So a couple of comments about Java is, like I mentioned, you have to go through the additional process of initializing JNIs, and we have to add the globe control class to the pane itself. So again, this is a Swing code that we basically took all the JPanel and JButtons and all the J stuff and kind of wrapped it around so we can be able to display this code in Java. So let's see if there are, this is kind of a good point to pose, and I was just checking to see if there are any questions. There's no questions so far. So my trusted advisors told me to hurry up and move along. So this is really a broad overview on how to just get started with the standalone applications. But the point I really want to emphasize is once you kind of write the first 2 lines of code, and once you have a root object in your application, all the code looks exactly the same, no matter if you are writing a UI plugin, if you're controlling STK from outside application, or if you're writing standalone applications. And I would like to spend the rest of the time kind of talking about best practices and pitfalls that you might encounter when using our object model. Another common complaint that we hear is lack of code sample for particular programming language. So if you look at our help, you probably noticed that most of our code samples are in C#. Since we released 11, there are many, we added more MATLAB code samples, as well as Python code samples. We added some Java, but the sample applications that come with STK install are still primary source of information for the Java syntax. Another complaint that we hear is when we actually look at the pages that the code samples only show how to do it in C#. So what I'm going to do is talk about a couple common places where people get stuck, and I'm going to show them in different programming language and then contrast and compare. So I'm hoping next time, even if you're a Java developer, next time you see a C# code samples, you'll be able to comprehend what we are trying to do and have easier time translating syntax between 2 languages. So one thing I mentioned before is that STK desktop application is the main source of workflow. So I was playing with something in MATLAB, so I created this facility and I just like to move it so it doesn't interfere with what I'm doing. So I just moved it a little bit. So when I run my C# application, I'm going to create a new facility, and I'm going to change the name of my facility to my facility. So if you look at, so a whole bunch of things are going on here. Let's start with the creation of facility. So I already have a root object, so I can get a current scenario from root object. So, and then I need to add additional object to my scenario. And if you look at the STK, facility is a child of scenario object. And if I were to add, let's say sensor, that sensor will be child of the facility object. So basically, when we add objects in a STK desktop application, we add it as a children to other objects. So the code works exactly the same. So I have my scenario, I have its child, and then I would add a new object. and I would pass this enumeration. So I will say it's a facility type, and it will create a facility called my facility, and it will save it to the variable. So if I look at the new method, it returns object called IAG, STK object. So this interface contains all the common interfaces for the STK objects. So the name, the class type, has linked to data providers, to analysis workbench, to widget object, and then each object had its own interface. So facility has interface called IAG facility. So we basically have three possible methods to declare our facility. So we can declare it as IAG STK object, we can declare it as IAG facility, or the one that encompasses both of them, which is AG facility. And as a C# or Java developer, you are told that you want to use concrete, you want to use classes, not interfaces, when creating objects. But if you look at all our documentation and all our code samples, we always use I. Apparently there was reason for before, but after extensive search, I can't find anybody to tell me why. So I've been recommended to anybody who would listen to actually use AG instead of IAG, which requires you to do additional casting. So in order for this object to be recognized as your facility, I have to cast it first to be used as the facility. If we look at the Java code, not too far, if I were to create the code would look pretty much the same. So I would go to scenario, get children collection, called the new method. Enumeration looks a little bit different, but it's pretty much the same, and then pass the facility name. And in Java, we use the special AG facility class. So for Java, we had to kind of go through additional hoops again. We had to use JNI, and then because we want our Java code to run both on Windows as well as Linux, kind of we have to write certain wrappers to make sure it works on both platforms. So while C# is using just AG facility, the Java uses additional word class. So, and then just kind of for fun, if we look at the MATLAB code, the way to create facility, again, it will be a root current scenario new, and then we pass a facility as in a quote and our facility name in quotes. So this is the reason why facility is because I run this code, and you don't have to do casting because Python and MATLAB are interpretive languages, so they'll figure out the proper syntax at the right time. But for compiled languages like C#, VB.NET, and Java, you will have to do casting. So now I have facility and I want to change its label. So by default, the label will not have a space because my object name cannot have a space, but that kind of looks ugly, so I want to add a space. And if I go back to help, I can search for the, so I went to library reference, STK object model and STK objects, and I'm going to Control F, come on. I'm going to search for AG facility. So I did this before. And so it carries for IG STK object and IG facility, and there are two more interfaces that are irrelevant for these purposes. So I'll go to AG facility, and I can see it has the graphics property. So I know I want to change graphics. So this will bring me to another page that has IG facility graphics. So I'll click on that. And now I see all the properties that are under graphics. And one I want to change is called label name. So if I click on this, it will tell me that this is read-write property. So I can change it if I want. So I will go back and run my code, and I will get the error eventually, sometime soon. Almost there. Come on. I will get an error that I'm trying to change read-only attribute, which makes absolutely no sense because help told me that this is rewritable property. Why is this the case? So if I go back to STK, create new facility, and I'll turn this one off. So, and open its properties. If I go to graphics, I can see that place for me to change the label is grayed out. What I have to do first is uncheck this box and then come here and change the name to my facility. So if I were to do this, the name is going to change. So let me go back to that panel. So the steps are required is unchecking this box and then only changing the name. So if I look back on my code, under graphics, there's another property called use instance name label. So I have to set it to false before I can change my facility name. So let me run the code. And voila, I have a facility, and it's called my facility with a space. So as you can see, if you look through our documentation and through just use IntelliSense, it kind of shows you that certain things can be done a certain way, but when you try them, they don't work. And the reason is object model always follows the logic of the STK desktop application. So if you ever, again, if you remember only one thing from this class, use the STK as a guide to write your code, because the workload will be identical. Another thing people get kind of stuck on are units. So let's go back to STK, and I'm going to go to scenario properties. So I'll change this. And if you look at scenario, these are all the units that STK has. So we have a distance and a small distance. We have date format and time format, angle and mass, so a whole bunch of, and if I want to change or get location of my property, I notice when I look at the panel, when I want to change this facility, that the units were in degrees. So I will assume that I need to get angle units. And I did for a long time, and then realized I was actually wrong. We actually have a special units called latitude units and longitude units to handle the latitude and longitude, because they have a specific set of mins and max. So latitude can go between, I believe, -90 to 180, and longitude can go from -180 to 360. So kind of handle going from 0 to 360 as well. And not only that, if I were to expand this, I can see that another valid unit is hours, column minutes, column seconds. So not only that I have to work with special units if I'm changing the location of my facility, I also have to be careful to make sure that there are no string characters. So STK cannot pass the value of the longitude and latitude as numbers. So when I initially was tasked to get a position of facility, I went to my code and I said, okay, so it's probably facility dot position dot latitude. No, it's not there. Longitude, not there. Instead of having actual properties that I would expect, I have a couple of sign methods and a couple of query methods. So instead of passing latitude and longitude, the user might want to have a Cartesian point, might want to have cylindrical or spherical location of my facility. So again, instead of passing, a doubles as I expect, I have to actually query STK and specify in which type of units I would like to have my location. So if I ask for planetodetic, I will get longitude, latitude, and altitude. But as I mentioned before, if I'm doing this in C#, I would have to create the out parameters. So I would have, if I'm looking at the signature of this method, I have to create 3 out parameters for latitude, longitude, and altitude. And the latitude and longitude are have to be objects, while altitude can be double. And again, this was done because we cannot ensure that our latitude and longitude are not going to include string characters. So we can't assume it's going to be a number. So we have to do a process that I call unboxing. So based on your unit type, I can, if I want to actually convert, if I want to convert the latitude into a double, so I'm doing something very dangerous here. I'm assuming that units are degrees. First I have to do is pass latitude, convert it as a string, and then use double.parse. So it's a 2-step process of converting the object latitude as an object type to latitude as a double type. But So this is how we do it in C#. The one thing that you probably notice, we have this reference parameters, and STK does this in many places. The problem is this only works in C# and or VB.NET, and like I said, most of our code samples are in those two languages. So if you are working with Java and you look at this code, it's almost useless for you because you can't do it that way. So let's go back to Java and let me try to do the same code again. And what we did here is, this is the code that corresponds. So what we did is, I don't know if you noticed as I was looking at intelligence in C#, for query planetadic, there's also, for each query method, there's additional method that has array in the name. So instead of passing 3 parameters by reference, we are asking the STK to return us all the values as array. And not only that, we are assuming that the first position is going to be latitude, second position is going to be longitude, and third position is going to be altitude. So we ask him basically STK to return values in a flat array, and then it's up to us, and hopefully with help of documentation, to figure out how to extract those values from the array. So in this case, the values are returned in what we call AGI safe array. So again, because we are using COM to move these objects around, COM uses safe arrays, so we need to force Java to use safe arrays. And then again, to make sure we work on both Linux and Windows platforms, in order for us to get the latitude, we have to go to position and actually get object at place 0, and we have this special method called getJavaObject. So this method kind of that's typecasting, so make sure the memory allocation is done properly. And again, we have to pass it to the string before we can call double.parse double. So as you can see, this is one method to allows us to pass use Java to get the sequence of the numbers. You will kind of use this array a lot, but when you look at the help, it will tell you to just use the reference parameters. So hopefully this kind of gives you a clue how to look at the help, even if you're working with Java or another language. Since we already have MATLAB open, the equivalent code in MATLAB, it will also have the same array as you can see in Java, and I will get 3x1 cell array, and the MATLAB is already going to convert everything for me into doubles. So if I look at position 1, it will return my what's this, latitude value. Again, in MATLAB, array starts at 1 while Java starts at 0, so please be careful. And then, since I'm already talking about different languages, the Java and C# allow you to use the enumerations. If you're working with JavaScript or some kind of scripting language, or if you're using Python without importing our libraries, you cannot use, you might not have enumeration available. So the way you would create a facility is each of the enumeration has a number assigned to it. So if I look at this enumeration, I can right click on this and say go to definition, and C# will kind of show me the enumerations that correspond to actual string. So eFacility has value of 8. So if you're working with JavaScript, Perl, or another scripting language, you can use C# or help to kind of look up the numbers and see which values are you should be using. So this kind of covers most of the stumbling blocks that people have, mostly about passing units back and forward, casting, and how to look at the output parameters in our help and then translate that to MATLAB or Java code. So thank you very much for attending, and hopefully you learned something and you found this useful.